What's good, everyone? It's Nigel here, Trinidad Empowerment Network. So Trinidadians hear words all the time, like deficits, national debt, borrowing, and you hear these words on the news all the time. You hear them talking about the deficit and the borrowing and the national debt, etc., etc. But what does it mean? What does it mean to you, the Trinidadian? What does it mean to you, Trinidad and Tobago, of course? What does it mean to you, the taxpayer? And today, I'm going to attempt to explain to you exactly what the deficit is, what it means to you, and how it affects you financially. So let's start off simply with the way a country is run. We essentially put in place a government to run the country, and that government is democratically elected by the people, whichever government we choose, whether it be the PNM, the UNC, or those of you who remember the NAR or the ANR, Mr. Robinson. That was my time in Trinidad. I remember him clearly. So we decide who we want to run the government in our country. So we elect the government. And when we elect whoever we decide we want to run the country, this government has to provide us with services. So we have things like a military, an army, we have police officers, we have firefighters, we have people who fix the road, we have teachers, people who educate us, we have hospitals, nurses, doctors, dentists, etc., etc. These are all paid for by the government. And of course, the government, who we've democratically elected, has to get people to work in these places. We have to get the doctors, we have to get the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the people cutting the grass to the side of the roads for attendees in Trinidad. And the government has to come up, firstly, find these people, and secondly, they have to be paid, right? So this is what we want from our government. We need them to provide us with services. They come up with the services we need, like I've already mentioned, and we then have to pay for these services. We have to pay the people to do the work. Now, how do we pay people to do the work? There's one of two ways. We do it through taxes or we borrow. Taxes or we borrow. That's the two ways we raise the money to pay the people that we employ to work for the government. Government workers, essentially, is what they're predominantly known as. Now, we mainly do it through taxes. So the government would tax corporations, businesses, and you, the individual, to raise the money, to raise the capital or the money to pay the people that work for the government. Now, this is where it gets a bit, not necessarily complicated, but a bit tricky, dependent on the person or the people we've elected to be in charge. So the government go ahead, they start taxing us. And they're going along taxing us, we go to work, they tax us, they tax these businesses and corporations. And then they have to use that money, like I've said, to pay people. But oftentimes, the government overspend or the amount of money that they tax us on, the amount of money they take from us in tax, whether it be value-added tax or corporation tax or income tax, they overspend. So a good example would be they budgeted to spend $1 billion. And come the end of the year, they've spent $2 billion. So the amount of money they tax us to pay for the services I've just spoken about, they've gone over it by $1 billion. Now they're head scratching, like, oh, well, we've got ourselves in a bit of a pickle here. That's an English term. We've got ourselves in a bit of trouble. We've overspent. So what do? So now they have two choices. They could increase taxes on you or the businesses, corporations, etc., or they could borrow. So who do they borrow from? They borrow from the rich, the multi-billionaires, huge businesses, corporations, etc., etc. If they do decide to borrow, borrowing does not come for free, as you know. You don't go to the bank and borrow some money and pay back exactly what you borrowed. You go to the bank, you borrow $1,000 and you pay back $1,500 or $2,000. There's an interest rate that comes with borrowing. And depending on your credit score, and every country has a credit score, just like you have an individual credit score, the bank assess how vulnerable lending money to you is. The more vulnerable you are, the higher the interest rate. It's the same with countries. So we've gone over the budget of what the tax income allows, and that creates what is known as the deficit. So when you hear newscasters and MPs talk about the deficit is essentially them overspending on the amount of tax they're taking from you, the taxpayers. So we're now in a deficit because we've overspent. We have to now borrow that money from someone to cover the deficit or increase taxes to cover that deficit. And no one likes their taxes being increased. Who wants their taxes being increased? So the government, who are looking at maybe the elections coming up, and the last thing they want to do is increase taxes. So they just go and borrow the money from whoever is willing to lend. This is why the rich stay rich, by the way, but that's another subject. But they borrow it from the rich. And the rich said, okay, I'm going to lend you some money. But I'm going to lend you it at such an obscene rate that you'll be paying this back for the next 20, 30 years. So the government, okay, that's fine. I don't want to raise taxes on the people because the election's coming up. They're going to vote me out if I raise taxes. So I want to stay in power. So they borrow the money from the rich. And they get the obscene interest rate that comes with the money they borrow. So they borrow, say, for example, 4 billion. And the rich said, well, you're going to have to pay me back 6 or 7 billion in interest. Where does the interest come from? The interest comes from the taxpayers. So the government now thinking, well, we don't want to increase tax. And of course, oftentimes they do. They haven't got a choice. They have to increase tax and take the risk. And oftentimes they increase the taxes at the start of their term in government, not at the end of the term. Because if they start to do it at the end of the term, they're going to get voted out. Elections coming up. They do it at the start of their term. So the government goes ahead and borrow the money. They borrow the money at an obscene interest rate. And now the people are paying the tax. They're paying the tax back on the interest rate for years. Now you understand what the deficit is. So this is why your decisions that you make to elect whoever you elect into power matters. Because if the government is incompetent and they overspend, then that money comes from your pocket. Now, there are ways the government could use to raise money, and they could start looking at creating businesses. What natural resources does the country have? Trinidad has oil and gas. So you could start bringing in revenue from oil and gas, right? So like I said, almost every video I've done so far, we talk about Petro-Trin. That was a great revenue builder for the government. It was a government-owned or a public-owned entity, not privately owned. So the government should have been bringing in a lot of money from a company like Petro-Trin, which is an oil refinery, into the country, into government, to be able to pay for the things that we need. That's a way the government can use to raise money as opposed to borrowing. Borrowing is essentially raising money. Borrowing raises money temporarily, as I've explained, but like I've said, you pay a huge deficit on the money that you borrow. And like I said, other than that, the government could then raise your taxes. And you hear it all the time, you're going to have to put the tax rate up to cover the deficit. They could also do things like cut back on government spending. Now, this is where it affects you. Because if they decide to cut back on government spending, education is affected. So people are going to school like, well, I can't get school books anymore because the government's cut back on that. Your healthcare is affected. You can't get an appointment to see your doctors, and because the government's cut back on the amount of doctors or nurses or whatnot that we have. The bush at the side of the road is growing high and no one's cutting it because there's no more 10 days to give to nobody to go and cut the bush. And that's how government you've heard about Doge in America, Doge, or the government efficiency, essentially, the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency. And this is what America attempted to do with Elon Musk. So Doge was there to cut back on government spending, but it did such a horrific job that they cut back on jobs that were actually needed, which caused a couple of plane crashes and whatnot in America. So government spending can be looked at and reined in if they are doing a horrible job, but you have to do it strategically and actually know what you're doing, because there are a lot of government jobs out there that actually needed. Education, healthcare, the roads need fixing. I mean, you see all the bad roads you see all the time. Just had cutting the budget from the fixing the roads and the pavement and whatnot. You get potholes everywhere. And oftentimes, as you know, in Trinidad, the roads are horrendous. And that's where the government's gone ahead and said, well, we need to rein back on government spending. We need to cut back on government spending. So the easiest thing is to cut back on the roads and whatnot. So this is essentially how countries work. This is a deficit interest rate. Hopefully this makes sense to you now. This is why the rich stay rich, because when we need money, we go to them to borrow that money. And they pay tax as well, yes, but the interest rate they put on the money that they lend us supersedes the tax that they pay to the government. And this is why we also say that we should tax the rich a lot more. We should not be allowing them to get away with things like corporation tax and hiding their assets in offshore accounts. If you work in Trinidad, you make your money in Trinidad, you pay your tax in Trinidad, and there should be no loopholes around paying your taxes. I hope this makes sense to you. I hope you understand how the deficit works now, and I hope you make better decisions going forward and in learning who has got the right plan for you in government moving forward. And I haven't even touched on government corruption yet. Maybe I'd leave that. Maybe I'd leave that for another video. But I hope that was clear. Much love. Thank you for subscribing, and I'll see you guys on my next video. For now, much love. Take care. Peace.